The old church club met every Sunday in Pine Valley, a small town where everyone knew each other but kept their secrets close. Jenny Smith walked into the big room for the first time, nervous and excited. Her sweet Grandma Mary had left her a letter and a small gold key before passing away last month. The letter simply said, "Join them on Sunday. They're waiting for you." Mr. Tom White, the club leader, was a tall man with white hair who always wore a black suit. He smiled at Jenny, but something about his smile made her feel uneasy. "Welcome, Jenny. Your Grandma Mary talked about you a lot before she went away." The way he said those last words made Jenny's heart beat faster. The club members sat in a circle on wooden chairs that looked like they belonged in a castle. Everyone wore dark clothes and kept looking at something in the middle of the room. There, on a red cushion, sat the prettiest silver cup Jenny had ever seen. The cup sparkled under the big light hanging from the ceiling, and it had strange pictures carved all over it that seemed to move in the light. When the old clock on the wall struck 7, Mr. White picked up the silver cup. For many years, our club has shared this special cup every Sunday. It makes us special. It picks special people. The drink inside looked like grape juice, but darker and clearer. Jenny watched as each person took a small sip, their eyes closed as if making a wish. Mrs. Green, a friendly-looking woman with rosy cheeks, sat next to Jenny and held her hand. "Don't worry, dear. Everyone feels scared their first time. But once you drink, you're part of our family forever." She smiled, but Jenny saw she was crying a little. Looking around the room, Jenny counted 7 empty chairs. When she asked about them, everyone went quiet. "Those people," Mr. White spoke very softly, "they were chosen, special ones, like your Grandma Mary." Before Jenny could ask what that meant, someone handed her the cup. It felt warm in her hands, like it had just come out of the oven. The drink inside moved by itself, making little circles that made her feel dizzy. As she lifted the cup, she noticed some words scratched on the bottom. They looked important, but she couldn't read them clearly. Mr. White stood behind her, watching her so closely it made her hands shake. Jenny wondered what kind of club her grandma had gotten her into and why so many members had disappeared. Jenny's hands trembled as she held the silver cup closer. Just then, old Mrs. Brown, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up. "Wait!" Her voice was shaky but loud. Everyone turned to look at her, and Mr. White's face turned dark with anger. "I can't keep quiet anymore. I know what happened to Mary, and to all the others." But before Mrs. Brown could say more, the lights flickered, and a strong wind blew through the room, even though all the windows were closed. When the lights came back on, Mrs. Brown was sitting in her chair again, looking confused, as if she couldn't remember what she had just said. Jenny noticed her eyes had turned completely blank, like foggy glass. The silver cup in Jenny's hand started to feel warmer, almost too hot to hold. She looked down and saw the liquid inside had changed color. Now it was deep blue, like the ocean at night. Strange whispers filled the room, but when Jenny looked around, nobody's lips were moving. They all stared at her, waiting. Mr. White cleared his throat. "Drink, Jenny. It's time." But something caught her eye. A small notebook peeking out of Mrs. Green's purse. On its cover, Jenny could see her Grandma Mary's handwriting. While everyone was focused on the cup, Jenny carefully slid the notebook closer with her foot. As she pretended to raise the cup to her lips, she noticed something else strange. In the large mirror behind Mr. White, some of the club members cast no reflection at all. Even stranger, those were the ones sitting next to the empty chairs. They looked solid enough in person, but the mirror told a different story. Suddenly, the church bells started ringing, even though it wasn't time. 7 loud bongs echoed through the room. With each ring, One of the members sitting by an empty chair seemed to flicker, like a TV with bad reception. Jenny's heart raced as she realized these people might not be people at all. "The cup chooses who stays and who goes," Mr. White said softly, his eyes now glowing with a faint silver light. "Some become part of our forever family. Others, well, your grandmother made her choice." He stepped closer and Jenny saw something impossible. She could see right through his hand as he reached for the cup. Jenny's mind raced. The notebook, the missing reflections, her grandmother's key, the warning scratched on the cup. It all had to mean something. But with every passing second, more members began to flicker, and the whispers grew louder. The liquid in the cup started to swirl faster, forming what looked like faces. Faces of people Jenny recognized from missing person posters she'd seen around Pine Valley. Mrs. Green grabbed Jenny's arm, her touch ice cold. "Drink, dear," she whispered, but her voice sounded like many voices speaking at once. "Join us in the in-between. Your grandmother is waiting." Jenny looked down at the cup again, and this time she could finally read the warning scratched into its bottom. What she saw made her blood run cold, and she realized she had only seconds to make a choice that would change everything. Jenny's heart pounded as she finally read the scratched warning. "The cup doesn't choose, it traps. Use the key at midnight." Her grandmother's golden key felt heavy in her pocket. A memory flashed in her mind. Grandma Mary teaching her a rhyme when she was little. "When silver turns to shadow, gold shows the way to go." While everyone waited for her to drink, Jenny pretended to stumble, spilling a few drops of the blue liquid on the floor. Where the drops fell, the wooden floorboards seemed to disappear, showing a deep, swirling darkness underneath. Nobody else seemed to notice, but Jenny saw tiny hands reaching up from the darkness, like drowning people asking for help. Mr. White's patience was wearing thin. His whole body flickered now, like an old film projection. "We've waited long enough," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Mary promised us her granddaughter would be the final piece." As he spoke, Jenny noticed something odd. There was a small door behind his chair, perfectly matching the size of her grandmother's key. The notebook near Jenny's feet had fallen open. In her grandmother's messy handwriting, she saw a list of dates, every Sunday for the past year. Next to each date was a name, and next to each name was the word saved or taken. Jenny's blood ran cold when she saw her own name listed for today, but the space next to it was blank, waiting to be filled. Mrs. Green and the other flickering members began to move their chairs closer, forming a tighter circle around Jenny. The room grew colder and Jenny could see her breath in the air. "Your grandmother tried to break our circle," Mrs. Green said, her voice now sounding ancient and hollow. "She thought she could save everyone, but instead she became one of us. Now you'll join us too." The church bells began to chime again, but this time it was different. Jenny counted the bongs. 11. Almost midnight. The silver cup in her hands grew so hot it nearly burned, but she couldn't let go. The liquid inside turned black, and Jenny saw faces swirling in it. Her grandmother, Mrs. Brown, before she went blank-eyed, and all the other missing members, their expressions frozen in terror. Mr. White raised his hands, and the remaining solid members began to chant in a language Jenny didn't understand. With each word, more of the floor seemed to dissolve into that swirling darkness. The flickering members were becoming more solid, while the others started to fade. Jenny realized with horror what was happening. The cup wasn't just taking people, it was switching them with something else. These ghostly members weren't the taken ones. They were whatever had replaced them. And now, they needed one more person to make their crossing permanent. As the final bell began to strike midnight, Jenny had to make her choice. The key in her pocket burned as hot as the cup in her hands. The small door behind Mr. White's chair started to glow with a faint golden light. She could drink from the cup and join whatever lived in that swirling darkness, or she could try to save everyone who had been taken, if she could just figure out how to use the key in time. But one wrong move, and she might end up trapped forever, just another empty chair in the old church club's circle. The final bell chimed midnight, and Jenny made her decision in a split second. She threw the burning silver cup at Mr. White, who tried to catch it, but his flickering hands went right through it. The cup crashed against the small door, spilling the black liquid everywhere. Instead of seeping into the floor, the liquid rolled toward the door like it was being pulled by a magnet. "No!" Mr. White's scream didn't sound human anymore. His face shifted, revealing something ancient and twisted underneath. The other flickering members rushed toward Jenny, their feet not touching the ground, but Jenny was faster. She pulled out her grandmother's key, diving past their grabbing hands. The key slid into the small door's lock perfectly. Behind her, Mrs. Green's friendly face melted away, showing sharp teeth and empty black eyes. "Your grandmother tried this too," she hissed. "Look what happened to her." The room started spinning, and more of the floor disappeared into darkness. Jenny turned the key, and golden light exploded from the door. The light hit each flickering member, and they screamed, not with human voices, but with sounds like breaking glass and rushing wind. Their fake bodies started cracking, showing the darkness inside them. The little door swung open, and Jenny saw what looked like a twisted mirror version of the meeting room. But in that other room, she saw people, real people, trapped behind a wall of swirling black liquid. Her grandmother Mary was there, pressing her hands against the dark wall, mouthing words Jenny couldn't hear. The notebook by Jenny's feet flipped open by itself, pages turning wildly. It stopped on a blank page, and words appeared in her grandmother's handwriting. "The cup trades the living for the dead. Break the cup, break the trade. But hurry, midnight only lasts so long." Jenny grabbed the dented silver cup from the floor. The dark creatures that had pretended to be club members were getting closer, their bodies twisting into impossible shapes. Mr. White's face had split open like a rotten fruit, showing nothing but swirling darkness inside. "You can't break it," he growled, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "The cup has existed for centuries. Hundreds have tried. Hundreds have failed. Hundreds have joined us." The other creatures laughed, the sound like breaking bones. But Jenny remembered something else, something her grandmother had taught her about silver. "Pure silver doesn't make a sound when it falls," she had said, "but mixed silver rings like a bell." Jenny had heard the cup ring when it hit the door. She looked at the cup closely and saw tiny letters etched along its base, mixed with iron to bind them. Iron, the metal that folklore said could hurt evil things. Jenny's mind raced. If the cup was part iron, then maybe... The creatures were almost on her. The darkness was spreading. The golden light from the door was fading. And in the other room, the trapped people were starting to disappear into the black liquid. Jenny had to make another choice, and fast. Jenny's next action came from pure instinct. She turned to the open door, wound up her arm, and threw the cup as hard as she could through the golden doorway. The moment the cup crossed between the worlds, an ear-splitting shriek filled the room. The dark creatures lunged for it but couldn't cross the threshold of golden light. The cup spun through the air in the mirror world, heading straight for the wall of black liquid. Jenny's grandmother Mary seemed to understand what was happening. She pushed against the dark wall with all her strength, her hands breaking through just enough to catch the cup. "Iron melts before silver," Jenny shouted through the doorway, remembering another of her grandmother's lessons. Mary nodded and held the cup against the black wall. The liquid began to bubble and steam where it touched the cup's iron-mixed surface. Back in the meeting room, the creatures were changing. Their fake human faces melted completely away, revealing something ancient and horrible. Bodies made of twisted shadow and eyes like dying stars. Mr. White's true form was the worst, a towering mass of writhing darkness with countless reaching hands. "Foolish child," his voice boomed. "Breaking the cup won't save them. It will destroy everything. Them, you, even us. Centuries of perfect balance ruined." But Jenny saw the fear in his star-like eyes. He was lying. The floor was almost completely gone now, replaced by that terrible void. Jenny held onto the door frame as the darkness pulled at her feet. Through the doorway, she watched her grandmother press the cup harder against the black wall. Cracks of golden light started spreading through the dark liquid. The notebook fluttered open again. New words appeared. "The trade goes both ways. 7 taken, 7 replaced. Break 1, break all." Jenny suddenly understood. The 7 empty chairs, the 7 flickering members. They weren't just any monsters. They were the first ones, the original creatures who had created the cup centuries ago. Mary looked through the doorway at Jenny, tears in her eyes. "Together," she shouted, her voice muffled but clear enough. Jenny nodded, understanding what they had to do. She reached through the golden light, feeling like her arm was passing through ice and fire at the same time. The creatures howled, realizing what was about to happen. They rushed forward as one massive wave of darkness. Mr. White's countless hands stretched toward Jenny, his true form blocking out the ceiling. "You'll trap yourself between worlds," he roared. "You'll be nothing, nowhere, no one." Jenny's fingers touched the cup in her grandmother's hands. The iron in it burned cold, the silver burned hot. The black wall was cracking more now, golden light pouring through. The creature's shadows touched Jenny's shoulders, their cold seeping into her bones. She had one chance to make this work, but everything hung on what would happen next. The cup pulsed in her grip like a heartbeat, as both worlds seemed to hold their breath. Just as the darkness began to pull Jenny in, she gripped the cup harder and shouted, "Now, Grandma!" Together, they twisted the cup in opposite directions. The sound it made was like 1,000 bells ringing at once. The cup split perfectly in half, and everything exploded into chaos. The wall of black liquid shattered like glass. The trapped people stumbled forward, gasping for air. The creatures screamed, their shadowy bodies being pulled apart by an invisible force. Mr. White's massive form collapsed in on itself, his star eyes going out one by one. "We only wanted to live again," he whispered, as his countless hands crumbled into nothing. The void beneath the floor started swirling like a whirlpool, but instead of pulling things in, it was pushing things out. Objects came flying up, old photographs, personal items, things that had been taken from all the victims over the years. Jenny spotted her grandmother's old locket among them. But something was wrong. The golden doorway was starting to close. The two halves of the cup were pulling away from each other, one half trying to return to each world. "Let go, Jenny," Mary shouted. "The cup has to be destroyed completely." "I won't leave you," Jenny cried, holding on to both the cup and the door frame. The void was spinning faster, and the creature's remains were forming into a new, darker whirlpool above. The two forces pulled at the broken cup like it was the center of everything. Mrs. Brown, now free from whatever had made her eyes go blank, grabbed Mary's hand. Other freed members formed a human chain, pulling. On Jenny's side, the real Mrs. Green, who had been locked in her own basement for months, appeared at the door and grabbed Jenny's waist. "Sometimes holding on isn't the answer," Mary said, looking at her granddaughter with sad but proud eyes. "Sometimes you have to let go to fix things." She nodded at Mrs. Green, who pulled Jenny back just as the cup halves finally separated. The explosion that followed was silent but powerful. The two halves of the cup dissolved into silver dust. The golden doorway collapsed, taking the mirror world with it. The void closed up like it had never existed, leaving solid floor in its place. The whirlpool of darkness above them scattered like smoke in the wind. Jenny found herself lying on the floor of the old church club, which now looked like a normal room with normal chairs. Around her, dazed but very much alive, were all the missing members. Her grandmother Mary helped her up, hugging her tight. "You did it," Mary whispered. "You broke the trade." She looked older than her flickering copy had appeared, but her eyes were bright and real. They created the cup centuries ago to trade their dying souls for living ones. Each year they needed new trades to stay in our world, but they forgot that borrowed time always runs out. As everyone reunited with their families, Jenny picked up her grandmother's notebook. The list of names now all said, "Saved." But on the last page, there was a new warning written in fresh ink that made her blood run cold. 7 words that suggested their victory might not be as complete as they thought. The 7 words in the notebook sent chills down Jenny's spine. Silver turns to shadow when moon dies. Just then, she noticed all the silver dust from the broken cup was moving, sliding across the floor like tiny rivers of mercury, flowing towards the window where the full moon hung low in the sky. "Grandma, look!" Jenny grabbed Mary's arm. The old woman's face went pale. "They knew," Mary whispered. "All this time, they knew we'd break the cup. That's why they wanted you specifically." She pulled out a small diary from her pocket, flipping through it frantically. "Your great-grandmother wrote about this. The cup wasn't their prison. It was their door. Breaking it didn't destroy them. It set us free," came a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The moonlight streaming through the windows turned dark, like black ink spreading through water. The silver dust rose into the air, forming shapes that looked like dancing humans, but wrong. Too tall, too fluid, too hungry. The rescued club members huddled together in the center of the room. Mrs. Brown pointed at the floor with a shaking hand. The empty chairs were casting shadows, even though there was no light to cast them. And the shadows were moving. "Quick, the notebook!" Mary grabbed it from Jenny, turning to a page filled with strange symbols. Your great-grandmother wasn't just writing about them. She was writing about how to stop them permanently. But as she began to read, the moonlight dimmed even more. Jenny remembered the rhyme again. "When silver turns to shadow, gold shows the way to go." She pulled out the golden key, which was glowing brighter than ever. The dancing silver shapes paused, seeming to watch it. "They're not free yet," Jenny realized. "They're still bound by rules, moon rules, silver rules, iron rules." She held the key higher, and the silver shapes retreated slightly. But there were 7 of them, and only one key. Mary's eyes lit up with understanding. "The trading goes both ways," she quoted from earlier. "Jenny, they're not trying to trade lives anymore. They're trying to trade entire worlds. Our world of light for their world of shadows." The shadows from the chairs began to rise up like black smoke, merging with the silver shapes. Through the windows, Jenny could see the entire town of Pine Valley going dark, as if the night itself was eating all the light. "We need to find the other doors," Mrs. Green said suddenly. This wasn't the only meeting place. "There are 7 across town, 1 for each of them." She pulled out an old map from behind a loose floorboard. 7 buildings were marked with silver stars, forming a pattern that looked oddly familiar. Jenny looked at her key, then at the pattern on the map, then at the dancing silver creatures that were growing stronger by the second. They had minutes, maybe less, before the moon reached its peak, and the creatures gained their full power. "The trade has to be completed or reversed by moonset," Mary read from the notebook. or both worlds collapse. She looked at Jenny with worry in her eyes. We have to split up. 7 doors, 7 keys. But we only have 1 key, Jenny started to say. But then she noticed something. In the moonlight, each rescued member's shadow looked different, each one holding what appeared to be a golden key. Our shadows remember, Mrs. Brown exclaimed, looking at her own shadow that clearly showed a golden key. All these years being trapped, our shadows stayed in their world. They kept the keys safe. The rescued members stood in a circle, and as if responding to some unspoken signal, each of their shadows stepped away from them, becoming solid for just a moment. Each shadow handed its owner a golden key, identical to Jenny's. Split into teams, Mary commanded, taking charge. Each freed member with a key leads a group. The map shows 7 locations: the church, the old library, Pine Valley High School, the abandoned train station, the Founder's Mansion, the covered bridge, and the town well. But as they began to organize, the silver creatures started to change. The swirling shapes twisted together, forming a giant silvery web that began to spread across the ceiling. Drops of what looked like liquid moonlight fell from it, and wherever they landed, reality seemed to bend and crack. They're breaking down the walls between worlds, Mary gasped. We need to hurry. The teams quickly formed and rushed out into the streets of Pine Valley. What they saw outside made them freeze in horror. The town had changed. The streets were like rivers of shifting shadows, and the buildings seemed to flicker between their normal appearance and twisted, darker versions of themselves. Townspeople walked around like sleepwalkers, their shadows moving in different directions than they were. Jenny's team headed for the old library. Through the library windows, she could see books floating in the air, their pages flipping rapidly as if being read by invisible hands. Mrs. Green's group ran toward the high school, where all the clocks had started running backward. Mary led her team to the covered bridge, which now seemed to cross over into complete darkness instead of the river. As they ran, Jenny's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Did you really think your great-grandmother was trying to stop us? Read the notebook again. Read her real name. Jenny pulled out the notebook, turning to the front cover. There, in faded ink, was a name she had never noticed before, and it made her heart stop. The silver web in the sky grew larger, now covering most of downtown. The moon was almost at its highest point. In the distance, Jenny could hear the town clock tower begin to chime. But it wasn't chiming the hour. It was chiming a pattern. The same 7 notes repeated over and over, a song that felt older than time itself. Through the growing darkness, Jenny could see the other teams reaching their locations. Each golden key glowed brighter as it got closer to its door. But something wasn't right. The silver creatures weren't trying to stop them. In fact, they seemed to be herding the teams exactly where they wanted them to go. Jenny looked at the map again, then at the pattern of the silver web in the sky. Suddenly, she realized what it reminded her of. It was the same pattern she had seen engraved on the silver cup. And if she was right about what that meant, they were all walking right into a trap that had been centuries in the making. Wait, she tried to shout to the other teams, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The moon reached its peak, and all 7 golden keys began to glow as one. The time for choices was running out, and Jenny finally understood the terrible truth about her family's real role in all of this. Jenny stared at the notebook's cover, her hands shaking. The name read Elizabeth Smith, Keeper of the 7. Not destroyer, keeper. Her great-grandmother hadn't been fighting the creatures. She had been protecting them, preparing for this very night. Stop! Jenny screamed into her phone, desperately trying to reach the other teams. But the call wouldn't go through. Instead, her screen showed a video call from an unknown number. When she answered, she saw 7 different views, one from each location. The other teams were already pushing their keys into hidden doors they'd found. The silver web in the sky pulsed with power. The song from the clock tower grew louder, and Jenny finally recognized it. The same lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her. But now the words came back to her with new meaning. 7 doors of gold so bright, bring the shadows into light. It was never about destroying them, Jenny whispered, understanding flooding in. It's about bringing them fully into our world. The cup wasn't strong enough. It could only bring parts of them, shadows of who they really were. That's why they needed the trades, to stay even partially real. Through the phone, she watched in horror as 6 golden keys turned in their locks. Each door swung open, releasing a burst of silver light into the sky. The web started spinning, forming a spiral pattern above Pine Valley. At its center, a hole began to open, showing a world of shifting shadows and impossible colors. Mrs. Green's voice crackled through the phone. "Jenny, what are you waiting for? Use your key. We have to finish this together." But something in her voice had changed. It sounded eager, hungry. Jenny looked closer at her phone screen. In each video, she could see the team leaders' faces reflected in the silver light. Their expressions were wrong, too excited, too knowing. Then she realized these weren't the people who had been rescued. These were the original 7, who had somehow switched places in the confusion of breaking the cup. The notebook flipped open by itself, turning to a page Jenny hadn't seen before. In her great-grandmother's handwriting, the 7 doors must never be opened together. 6 will bring their world closer, but the 7th will tear the barrier forever. The Smith family's duty is to keep the 7th key separate, to prevent the final door from ever being opened. Jenny stood alone in front of the library's hidden door, her key growing warmer by the second. Above her, the hole in reality was growing larger. Through it, she could see massive shapes moving, ancient things waiting to cross over. Her phone exploded with messages from the other teams. No, not teams, the creatures disguised as them, begging her to open the final door. Where was her real grandmother? The real Mrs. Green? All the actually rescued people? Jenny looked back at the church and saw something that made her heart skip. A light in the basement window and shadows moving inside. They had all been locked away again, right under her nose. The moon was starting to set. Soon, the window between worlds would close. Jenny had to make an impossible choice. Open the 7th door and complete what her great-grandmother had apparently wanted, or find a way to reverse everything that had already been set in motion. And somewhere in the darkness, she heard her grandmother's real voice, faint but clear, telling her there was a third option nobody had considered. Section 10, Final Section. Jenny's racing thoughts were interrupted by a familiar song, not from the clock tower this time, but from her pocket. The golden key was humming the lullaby, but with a verse she'd never heard before. When 6 gates stand open wide, 7th key shows what's inside. Suddenly Jenny understood. She ran toward the church basement, key held high. The silver creatures tried to stop her, their borrowed human forms melting away completely now. But the key's golden light kept them at bay just enough. In the basement, she found everyone trapped behind a darkness that looked like black glass. Her grandmother pressed her hands against it, mouthing words. Jenny held up the notebook, and Mary pointed frantically at its pages. As Jenny flipped through, words began rearranging themselves, revealing the truth. Elizabeth Smith hadn't been protecting the creatures. She'd been containing them. The 7 doors weren't meant to open their world. They were pieces of a lock. Each time a door opened, it didn't just let their world in. It let part of our world into theirs. And the 7th key? It wasn't a key at all. Jenny looked at the golden object in her hand. In the basement's dim light, She could see tiny writing along its edge. To lock all doors, return what's borrowed. The realization hit her. It was a plug, meant to seal both worlds forever once they were properly aligned. Above ground, the creatures had realized what she discovered. The silver web began spinning faster, and the hole in reality grew larger. "Your great-grandmother failed," Mr. White's voice boomed from everywhere. "She didn't have the strength to finish it. What makes you think you do?" But Jenny wasn't listening. She was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 doors open. 6 pieces of our world crossing into theirs. The basement itself was the 7th location, right in the center of Pine Valley. And unlike the other doors, this one wasn't meant to be opened. "Sometimes holding on isn't the answer," Jenny repeated her grandmother's words. She raised the key high, and it floated from her hand, glowing brighter than ever. The creatures screamed, realizing too late what was happening. The key shot upward, through the basement ceiling, through the church roof, straight into the center of the spiral. The hole in reality started to shrink, pulling the silver web with it. "Now!" Jenny shouted. Everyone in the basement began singing the lullaby. The full version, with words passed down through generations of Smiths. Each note seemed to strengthen the key's power. The creatures tried one last desperate attempt. They merged together, forming a massive wave of silver and shadow that rushed toward the basement. But as they hit the black glass barrier, something strange happened. Instead of breaking through, they became part of it, trapped between worlds just as they had trapped others. The golden key pulsed once, twice, and on the third pulse, everything changed. The 6 open doors slammed shut across town. The hole in reality sealed itself with a sound like thunder. The black glass in the basement shattered, freeing everyone trapped behind it. When it was over, Pine Valley looked normal again. But in every reflection, windows, mirrors, puddles, you could see them. The creatures were frozen like statues, forever caught between worlds, their silver forms slowly fading into nothing more than strange shadows that people would eventually stop noticing. The town had changed. The streets were like rivers of shifting shadows, and the buildings seemed to flicker between their normal appearance and twisted, darker versions of themselves. Townspeople walked around like sleepwalkers, their shadows moving in different directions than they were. Jenny's team headed for the old library. Through the library windows, she could see books floating in the air, their pages flipping rapidly, as if being read by invisible hands. Mrs. Green's group ran toward the high school, where all the clocks had started running backward. Mary led her team to the covered bridge, which now seemed to cross over into complete darkness instead of the river. As they ran, Jenny's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Did you really think your great-grandmother was trying to stop us? Read the notebook again. Read her real name." Jenny pulled out the notebook, turning to the front cover. There, in faded ink, was a name she had never noticed before, and it made her heart stop. The silver web in the sky grew larger, now covering most of downtown. The moon was almost at its highest point. In the distance, Jenny could hear the town clock tower begin to chime. But it wasn't chiming the hour. It was chiming a pattern. The same 7 notes repeated over and over, a song that felt older than time itself. Through the growing darkness, Jenny could see the other teams reaching their locations. Each golden key glowed brighter as it got closer to its door. But something wasn't right. The silver creatures weren't trying to stop them. In fact, they seemed to be herding the teams exactly where they wanted them to go. Jenny looked at the map again, then at the pattern of the silver web in the sky. Suddenly, she realized what it reminded her of. It was the same pattern she had seen engraved on the silver cup, And if she was right about what that meant, they were all walking right into a trap that had been centuries in the making. "Wait!" she tried to shout to the other teams, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The moon reached its peak, and all 7 golden keys began to glow as one. The time for choices was running out, and Jenny finally understood the terrible truth about her family's real role in all of this. Jenny stared at the notebook's cover, her hands shaking. The name read, Elizabeth Smith, Keeper of the 7. Not destroyer, keeper. Her great-grandmother hadn't been fighting the creatures. She had been protecting them, preparing for this very night. "Stop!" Jenny screamed into her phone, desperately trying to reach the other teams. But the call wouldn't go through. Instead, her screen showed a video call from an unknown number. When she answered, she saw 7 different views, one from each location. The other teams were already pushing their keys into hidden doors they'd found. The silver web in the sky pulsed with power. The song from the clock tower grew louder, and Jenny finally recognized it. The same lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her. But now, the words came back to her with new meaning. 7 doors of gold so bright, bring the shadows into light. It was never about destroying them, Jenny whispered, understanding flooding in. It's about bringing them fully into our world. The cup wasn't strong enough. It could only bring parts of them, shadows of who they really were. That's why they needed the trades, to stay even partially real. Through the phone, she watched in horror as 6 golden keys turned in their locks. Each door swung open, releasing a burst of silver light into the sky. The web started spinning, forming a spiral pattern above Pine Valley. At its center, a hole began to open, showing a world of shifting shadows and impossible colors. Mrs. Green's voice crackled through the phone. "Jenny, what are you waiting for? Use your key. We have to finish this together." But something in her voice had changed. It sounded eager, hungry. Jenny looked closer at her phone screen. In each video, she could see the team leaders' faces reflected in the silver light. Their expressions were wrong, too excited, too knowing. Then she realized these weren't the people who had been rescued. These were the original 7, who had somehow switched places in the confusion of breaking the cup. The notebook flipped open by itself, turning to a page Jenny hadn't seen before. In her great-grandmother's handwriting, the 7 doors must never be opened together. 6 will bring their world closer, but the 7th will tear the barrier forever. The Smith family's duty is to keep the 7th key separate, to prevent the final door from ever being opened.